Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to today's webinar about vulnerability management workflows and ticketing. We're just going to give it another couple minutes so that folks can keep trickling in. I see the number keeps going up, but we'll be starting in the next minute or two before we get going. So take this opportunity if you have to go grab some coffee. It's the 2 o'clock in the afternoon blues. We'll be starting here in a moment. Or if you just want to look at the beautiful design slide that we're very proud of here for our title slide that works too. Normally I like to start these things off with a joke, but don't know, I didn't have time to make one today, so I apologize in advance to everybody who's used to that. But we're gonna have fun anyway. It's gonna be good. Let's give it another minute or so and call it a day. All right. Howdy, everybody. Thanks for joining the ticketing workflow webinar that we're doing today, specifically around vulnerability management. We're really excited to talk about this topic, and anybody that is curious why I'm dressed in a suit and tie, normally in a hoodie, I'm actually joining you live from the first ever vulnerability specific conference. It's called VulnCon. So here's our beautiful badge. Nucleus being the first ever platinum sponsor of the conference, we're very excited to partner with first organization to bring this to bear. And super exciting here in Raleigh, North Carolina. So if you're familiar with it, didn't have a chance to go. It was being live streamed, so you should be able to look at all the topics later. It was pretty cool. We actually there were some topics even around like how CVEs and CNAs should be treated and things like that. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining. Let's go ahead and get this thing started. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. It's a really difficult topic, oftentimes to get right. It's really around ticketing and how does ticketing fit into the vulnerability management workflows, right? So, there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of nuance here. So we're going to dive pretty deep, and it's going to be a lot of fun, and we're going to get to see a lot of ways that we see organizations are successful with it and how it works. So let's go ahead and get started. So we'll jump right in. So before we do that, I just want to take a quick sidebar for those who aren't familiar with us. I know we have a lot of folks that do know who Nucleus is, but there are also a lot of folks that don't, that come to these webinars. And so why we're talking about ticketing workflows and why Nucleus is qualified even to have this conversation is, so we're a SaaS company that focuses on vulnerability management workflows, right? So, we're not looking at just prioritization or just ticketing or just like assignment of ownership and things like that. We're actually looking at the holistic vulnerability management process, and we work with really large, complex organizations. And so we've done this a lot. We do this all the time. And so we've got, over 100 customers now. And so what we're doing here is we're looking at a lot of the patterns that we see with our customer base as well, right? So you have the opportunity here to learn from other companies that are focusing on these same types of scenarios, right? So this is Nucleus in a nutshell, and this is why we're talking about ticketing and why we even know what the heck is going on when it comes to ticketing. So that's us. And with that, let's jump into what we're all here to talk about. And before we really jump into everything that we're going to be talking about, ticketing, I just want to be clear with some of our terminology, right? So, you have the term vulnerability, you have the term assets and risk, and all this gets thrown around all the time. And that was very much on display here today at the VulnCon. And so what we mean when we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about it in a broad sense, right? We're not talking about just an individual CVE. We're actually talking about vulnerabilities as a weakness in general, right? So it could be anything you want. It could be weak configuration. It could be default passwords, those types of things. So we're using it in a more general sense. Same thing when I say asset, right? So I'm going to say asset a lot. But what I mean by asset is just any sort of object on which a vulnerability can exist. So a lot of folks, when I say asset, they think like a workstation or a device. We actually mean it in a much broader context, in a kind of more generic and theoretical way, right? So just wanted to clear that up real quick before we got started. And then when I talk about risk, risk is when you put together vulnerabilities on assets to kind of come together and determine what an ultimate risk on an asset is, right? So when I talk about risk and how I'll be referring to it today in this context is really really that way, right? So just kind of keep this in mind as we get started, and then we'll go from there, right? So I just wanted to be clear, because I'm going to be using these terms a lot today. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page and I'm not confusing anybody, especially those of us that have joined from Finland. Thank you so much for joining so far away. So to really talk about ticketing, we really have to start by deconstructing and looking at how vulnerability prioritization happens within the VM team and how the organization as a whole really likes to work in the remediation workflows, right? So when I think about vulnerability prioritization, the first thing that comes to mind, everybody talks about CDSS, right? So it's a prioritization system. If you're so inclined, feel free to drop other systems in the chat. But just a couple that come to mind also is things like EPSS, so exploit prediction scoring system, right? There's a whole concept around risk scoring, and then there's also this concept called risk-based, and you start to see this happening all throughout our industry, right? And so when you're looking at all of these different systems, they all really have something in common, right? And the thing that they have in common is that they're all very much list-based, right? And what I mean by that is that their whole purpose is to answer the question of what is the individual item that poses the most risk to my business, right? And so, if you look at an example like CBSS scores, you have a scale of 1 to 10. You look at EPSS, score of 0 to 100. Take whatever risk score you can think of, and it's out of 100, out of 10, out of 1,000, out of 1,000,000. It doesn't really matter, right? The underlying idea is that these are actually all trying to do the same thing effectively, which is identify the individual item that actually poses the most risk to my business, right? And so when we think about prioritization, this is generally the construct under which a lot of our VM teams are actually looking, right? And the systems in the industry is just built up to operate in this particular way, right? So let's contrast that to how a business operates, because this is where the discrepancy between ticketing and how we do vulnerability management really starts to take shape. So when you look at a business is not looking at what is the individual item that's the most risky to my business. And you can look at the same thing from any other lens. What's the specific customer that's going to provide the most value to my business, right? That's one way of looking at it, but generally in a business, what's happening is you're trying to maximize ROI, you're trying to maximize efficiency. And how that translates into a vulnerability management space is how can we fix the maximum number of vulnerabilities with a certain amount of money? So if I spend $1,000, how many vulnerabilities can I fix in that time? Or how expensive is it to fix each individual vulnerability so that I can start doing this modeling at a higher level? I mean, you see a lot of different frameworks around this, right? So there's this FAIR model that people are trying to adapt to vulnerability management. If you look at all these different models that businesses try to use, businesses love modeling. They're trying to identify what is the way that we can maximize our remediation, right? And so if I specifically kind of tie that to the vulnerability space, it means that you're trying to group things by other attributes, right? So you could say, I want to group all my vulnerabilities by a particular due date, right? So that's your patch Tuesday, like all vulnerabilities need to be fixed on this day. We're looking at things like levels of effort. Well, I actually want to fix vulnerabilities based on how hard they are to fix. I want to fix as many different items as possible by taking one action. I want to be able to fix items based on the fact that I can, just take one particular button click and I can roll that out to a whole fleet of tools or a whole fleet of assets. And so when we're looking at the differences between the way businesses operate and then the way the vulnerability management teams within businesses operate, you get this very interesting discrepancy, right? So I've taken the liberty, you may have seen this graphic before. I created this kind of compare and contrast chart of how you can think about the way that this works, right? And we call this at Nucleus, we call this precision-based prioritization versus efficiency-based prioritization. And the secret is you actually need both, right? You don't want to pick one or the other. And we'll get into that here in a bit later today. But just for the comparison and contrast, on the left-hand side for precision-based, it's all about how do we fix the utmost critical thing to our business, right? So that'd be your CBSS scores, EPSS scores. And it doesn't matter how sophisticated you get with this because you can overlay threat intelligence, you can overlay exploitation information. But at the end of the day, what's happening is you're still trying to identify that needle in the haystack. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have basically a complete disregard for how important an individual item is. And it's all about how to maximize the output kind of like a factory, right? It's like, how do we just get that assembly line moving to do as much as possible with as little as possible, right? So that's kind of the area that we're operating in today as an industry, right? So what happens is that this discrepancy actually causes this very kind of vague, confusing, like call it industry, kind of like a way that you should operate, like an industry best practice, right? So this right now, if we look at this is from Qualys, right? It's the Qualys VMDR lifecycle. You get this very vague kind of, this is how you should do vulnerability management or risk management, right? You have started asset management and you go all the way back to asset management, but there's always lacking details, and there's always these opportunities to do things a whole bunch of different ways, and that nuance is not captured within kind of your traditional industry kind of best practices, right? So what ends up happening is analyst bingo. And, Nucleus, we've been part of this for a long time, right? So I think in the time that we've been around, I believe that we have been called, like, I think 7 or 8 different acronyms, depending on how you want to look at it, right? So we aggregate vulnerability data. And what that means is that we could have been VRM, VPT, RBVM, TVM, now CTEM, ASM, ASPM, CSPM, right? We're all of these categories and none of these categories at the same time. And a lot of this is caused by this discrepancy between how vulnerability management thinks about its problems and how the businesses at a higher level think about these problems. So you end up with tons of vendors and vendors and vendors. And so, but how do we get on top of this, and how do organizations really connect up your vulnerability processes to your actual kind of remediation processes in a way that scales? And so this is what we're going to be really kind of digging into today. So let's take a moment, take a deep breath, try not to get triggered by any sort of PTSD, and say, this is how our normal ticketing workflow struggles kind of manifest, right? So just in a normal sense, there's a huge amount of vulnerability data, and VM teams are spending all day, even if they knew every single vulnerability they wanted to create a ticket for, even if it takes you 5 minutes, 10 minutes to create a single ticket, you're spending all day just managing and creating tickets, right? Being able to report on remediation once you've created a ticket, being able to then, like we always have this saying in the defense industrial base, which is once you give up information to somebody else, you've lost control of that information. Now, I feel very similarly about ticketing workflows and remediation. So once you create a ticket and you hand that ticket off to another part of your organization, you really lose control of it. You have no idea if they're actually going to work on it. It's really difficult to get visibility into that ticket. And if you've got 50 teams to manage, each individual item or each individual team is managing tickets independently, and it's very difficult to get visibility into what's going on. So see, these are some of the challenges and the struggles that we see that are pretty common. Yeah, I am missing Chasm in here. Yeah, there's a ton of challenges with all of this. There's ownership challenges, as one of you also mentioned, for sure. But what ends up happening is that prioritization of tickets becomes its own independent challenge outside of prioritizing vulnerabilities, because vulnerability management is one list, and then there's the ticketing list on the other side, which is a different team and have different priorities. And so it all kind of goes back into this big kind of chaotic cluster of I'll call it confusion and vagueness, right? And so you tie all that together, and then what often happens too is that you get these emergency patching incidents where a threat team will say, hey, this is a problem we need to jump on right now. And what ends up happening is you just start falling behind, especially at very large scale. And so how do we get on top of this, and how do we do that, and how do we set up a ticketing workflow to be really successful is a trick, right? And there's a lot of value here, even outside of some of the topics we'll be talking about today. So all of this to say that remediation is really expensive. Even if it costs you, let's say, $4,000 to fix a single vulnerability, if you've got 1 million vulnerabilities, you have to now multiply that by 4,000. And so the numbers get really big. And so obviously this is why prioritization exists in the first place. But the numbers get astronomically huge, and it's daunting to try to figure it out on your own. So this is where we jump into an example ticketing workflow. So this is kind of your starter. This is your starter pack, if you will. This is what you get when you first open the box of how most folks end up using ticketing workflows when they first get started, right? So let's jump into it. So what will normally happen is you'll have a vulnerability that gets discovered on an asset, right? From there, what will happen is you have a VM analyst that goes in and triages that vulnerability. what I mean by triage is, they'll figure out like, is this real? What's the priority of this? Is it really bad? Is it really good? Do we need to adjust the priority, the technical severity? There's a lot of different ways to do that. I'm not going to deep dive into each one of those today, but what will generally happen is a VM analyst will triage that vulnerability. And then in this example, we're using Jira, but take your pick on ticketing system. In fact, you could have multiple ticketing systems, but let's just pick one. So then the analyst will manually create a ticket in Jira for a team to go consume. And the important thing to note here is actually creating a single ticket, right? So the analyst is creating tickets. From there, some team is going to then consume the tickets that were created by the VM folks. And then what they're going to go do is they're going to go take that and they're going to prioritize it in their own backlog with fixes and things of that nature so that it's like, okay, what should actually happen here, right? Because you have to get it into a sprint workflow, you got to get it into a patch management workflow, et cetera, right? There's a lot of different ways that will happen. Now, here's the tricky part, right? How does the vulnerability manager go in and figure out what's actually happening with those tickets? So in this scenario, when you just create tickets directly into the ticketing system, you need to go in, you need to look at every backlog, you need to figure out what's going on. And so this is where a lot of that manual effort really comes in. And this breaks down at scale pretty quickly to be able to say, well, a vulnerability analyst needs to get status and state and report on the status of every ticket that's going on in your environment. Now, if we multiply that by the number of vulnerabilities that we have, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that we need a better system in order to make this happen. Because if I have to do this even 50 times a day for 50 new vulnerabilities, I mean, that becomes unbearably overwhelming very quickly and just fraught with challenges and issues like that. So let's look at the specific challenges, right? So for this particular workflow, one of the main challenges that what'll happen is one of your main challenges is that when a ticket's created, it's very difficult to validate the actions that are happening. How do you know if somebody even closes a ticket that the vulnerability was fixed until you look at a new scan or a new scan comes in? There's no real easy way. You have to kind of do it on a case-by-case basis, which kind of sucks. And then you can't really report, like to extend on that, you can't really report on what the tickets have actually been created. So like, for example, let's say that every vulnerability ticket, every ticket that gets created that's a vulnerability is actually considered a bug ticket, which a lot of sprint teams will do. They want to just treat it as a bug because they have their own process to fix bugs in a certain way. Well, how is I, as a vulnerability analyst, going to go in and report on all of the vulnerability-derived tickets if they're all marked as bugs? So it becomes very challenging, especially to do that across projects and backlogs and things like that. And if anybody's used JQL, you know that that's a struggle. And so what ends up happening is that there's a ton of manual work just to create the tickets and then to consume the tickets. So it's not just the VM team that's spending a lot of time creating tickets. The teams themselves are spending a lot of time consuming these tickets to figure out where they should go. There's a big grooming process that needs to happen, right? And there's just ends up being too many of these tickets. And so this is the kind of normal, I call this, again, the starter pack. So this is where most organizations start up, and this works for a period of time until you realize that this just doesn't work within an organization of any scale, right? And the joke that we have internally here at Nucleus is that scale actually happens a lot faster than you think. So what's kind of the next step that happens? So the next step that happens, and we're going to use an example like a Nucleus, but take your pick on a system that kind of can do something similar to Nucleus, which is aggregate all your vulnerability data, provide that source of truth, and record that. So what'll normally happen in this case, instead of, if we contrast that to before, a finding would get discovered on an asset. Now, instead of a VM analyst triaging it, it actually goes into a separate system, right? And then what the VM analyst will do instead is that they will spend their time to create initiatives or epics inside of Jira. So they're going to spend more time on kind of the organization of how the system is going to work to drop tickets into different backlogs in a scalable way. And then what will happen is that we'll set up a Nucleus or a similar solution to automatically create tickets, but they're automatically being tied to initiatives. So that initiative could be anything that you want. And this is where it gets really interesting and cool. And this is where I say it's kind of the next step, where you say, well, each individual ticket is actually going to get tied back to, like, hey, fix all of our Adobe vulnerabilities. And then you can drop all of those. You can have a Nucleus system build and create all those tickets tied back to your initiative to, fix all Adobe vulnerabilities. And you can easily report on that because they're all tied back to initiatives. and you have the information right available and at hand. And so what that means is that the teams inside of Jira or similar solution consumes the epics, not the individual tickets. And they have the ability to, the initiative in this case, there was a question around, does the initiative work like an epic or feature? The answer would be yes, where you can kind of nest your tickets underneath it. It's just you have to pay extra for that in Jira. It's kind of, they call it advanced roadmaps, but there's different ways to kind of manage it. The idea is that you actually have a single item that represents your strategy and what you're trying to do, so that your VM team plugs into the initiative, and then the tickets themselves are just used as items for remediation work. So the work itself still happens in the tickets, but because the tickets are linked back to the initiative, you can report on the initiative at a higher level. And you could do that really easily. And now all of a sudden, if we're going to use the example of JQL again with Jira, it makes it really straightforward to say, well, hey, show me the status of all tickets within this larger initiative broken down by team. It becomes very simple to pull that kind of information. Now, where it becomes really interesting and neat is that all of that data, because it flows back up into a system like Nucleus, which is basically managing all of your tickets for you, that we can push all of that data into a reporting solution up the chain, which means that your remediation teams or your developers actually can consume the information in Jira, they fix everything, and then these initiatives and these epics are actually what links your tickets and remediation all the way up to your strategy at a global level. So then management is consuming data within a Power BI solution or a BI tool, and they can see the metrics of remediation progress, but it's actually your teams that are operating within themselves, right? And so it's really cool, because what also can happen is you can connect up the teams directly to Nucleus, and you can have them self-manage their own tickets. It allows you to start democratizing the process and socializing it everywhere else. And so I can really get the data that I need and I want in the format that I need and want it, without having to, rely on other teams. So let's look at some kind of alterations to this workflow, right? Because this is, like I said, this is sort of step 2. So step 1 is you just are manually creating tickets out of vulnerabilities themselves. And this can happen from vulnerability scanning tools. You could do it directly there. You could do it through a SQL script or anything like that. But then you insert a solution like a Nucleus, or kind of a mid tier, to manage all of this for you, and it unlocks a ton of opportunities. So let's look at what some of those benefits are before we jump into the next kind of phase, right? So the first real kind of benefit here is that linkage. It's the full auditability of remediation action being tied back to a vulnerability itself. So, and all of this, you can obviously do this all manually, but if you have a solution like a Nucleus, what ends up happening is that all of this can actually happen via automation. So it keeps the manual work to a minimum when you're really working on it. The second is around reporting. So like I mentioned before, it's very challenging to report inside of Jira itself, or a ServiceNow, or any other type of BMC remedy, take your pick. And so being able to connect everything up to the reporting solutions that you're already using is a huge benefit, because then every user and stakeholder in the organization has the opportunity to consume the data in the way that they need and want, right? So it allows you to pull out and start reporting on things beyond just, hey, was this remediated or not? You have SLA tracking, you've got vulnerability remediation status, MTTR, things like that, right? And then, of course, finally, you get to reduce the effort, right? Who wants to spend all day just managing tickets? I want to spend time as a VM analyst, like doing work and then having my work auto-tracked for me, right? It's kind of like the old thing where it's like, why, like I hate having to do a punch card, to clock in. I just want to show up and then have my time automatically tracked for me, right? It's like it's these little things that take a lot of time and are very annoying, but they cause huge problems within your ticketing workflows. Now, I am going to just take a side note here. There's a question. Okay, so the question is around, is Jira a hard requirement with Nucleus, or is it just used as an example? Jira is just an example. You take your pick of ticketing solutions, and it'll work, the same with all of them. So that's the answer there. Thank you for the question. As noted, we're happy to answer questions as we go through this, so feel free to jump in with more as we go. Now, this, as a reminder, this was what we were looking at. Let's look at some variations of how you can make this happen, right? So this is just an example. It doesn't have to be just, Power BI and Jira and all of those things. Let's just look at an example of what could happen, right? So for example, management could actually log directly into a tool like Nucleus, depending on your reporting requirements too, right? So you can start to simplify some of the workflows. You have the ability to kind of change how certain things happen. And where we're going to really dig into today is in this little red box that I just created. So this little red box is where we view in the ticketing workflows is actually the biggest opportunity for improvements and being able to do that at scale. And I'll explain what those are here momentarily. Another question from another anonymous attendee is, how do you track the tickets after they're created? Well, I can't speak for other solutions, but in Nucleus, if every ticket that we create, we track bidirectionally. So you create a ticket in Jira or ServiceNow or GitHub or GitLab or whatever, and we actually will read the states and statuses of those back, and then you can report on them inside the platform, or you can push that data to any other reporting platform that you like. So that's how we would keep track of them at Nucleus. I obviously can't speak for other solutions and systems, but that's how we do it. Now, hopefully all that makes sense. We're going to dive in now. We're going to zoom into this little red box, which is where when you start to scale out and you start to think about really sophisticated ticketing programs, this is where the opportunity really lies, but it's where all the work is too, right? This is where it starts to get very complex. So what we just looked at is what I call vulnerability-based tickets. So this would be sort of the first step, right? So this is that example we just looked at. What happens is a finding gets discovered on an asset, VM analyst triages it. You have to identify the team that owns the ticket. You have to create the tickets by hand for vulnerability. The team consumes the ticket, and then a VM analyst re-reviews it, right? So that's kind of your basic workflow for a vulnerability-based ticket. Now, there are opportunities for specialization within the ticketing workflows, and you do it by adding additional steps, which is where the work comes in, and I mentioned. So the second way you can do this is what we call asset-based tickets. So this is more traditionally used in a very patch-heavy, infrastructure-heavy type organization, where you basically can just say, I want to update Windows 10, and then have a large swath of vulnerabilities fixed. And you can ticket by asset, where you say, hey, just run all the latest patches for a particular asset. So the way that changes the workflow is that a finding gets discovered, your VM analyst triages it, other vulnerabilities on the same asset need to get identified. Then you need to identify the team that owns the assets. Then you need to create the ticket for each asset instead of for each vulnerability. The team still consumes the ticket. You still have to triage the ticket. You still have to prioritize the ticket. But by adding that extra step of identifying other vulnerabilities on the same asset, it allows you to then create a ticket that is per asset instead of per vulnerability. And I know this is all probably pretty kind of self-explanatory and obvious. It's going to get a little bit more complex from here. So I just wanted to start simply, because you can start to really kind of scale up the complexity and the efficacy of your ticketing workflow program from here. Which brings us to option 3, which is what I call team-based tickets. So these would be where you actually are not just grouping by individual or ticketing just by vulnerabilities, but you're ticketing by a vulnerability on an asset within a team, right? So you have to do all this kind of advanced filtering within your workflows and within your kind of VM pipeline to be able to do this at scale automatically, right? So let's look at this example. We added another step. Finding gets discovered on an asset. Your VM analyst triages it. Now, instead of starting by asset, instead of starting by other vulnerabilities on the asset, you actually start by looking at the team that owns the asset that the vulnerability exists on. So it goes discovered, triage, identify the team. From there, then you identify the other vulnerabilities on the asset. Then you take that asset and you actually will then identify other assets with the same vulnerabilities that are owned by the same team. So now you're combining team ownership, asset ownership, and vulnerabilities themselves to be able to say, we can create a ticket for each team vulnerability combo with the assets listed within that ticket, right? So now you can create one ticket that says, fix this one vulnerability on these 5 assets, and you can do it that way. And then you can manage the ticket right there in that one context, right? So it's different because it's one-to-one vulnerability to asset to ticket. Then there's many vulnerabilities to one asset to one ticket. And then in this scenario, it's potentially one vulnerability to many assets to one team to one ticket. Or you could even do many vulnerabilities that are all the same to many assets to one team to one ticket. So it's I probably should have honestly graphed this out a little bit better. But live and learn. So it allows you to start really consolidating how you ticket and how you workflow within your ticketing systems. And this hopefully is starting to kind of, if we think back to the efficiency-based vulnerability prioritization or efficiency-based remediation, hopefully you're getting the wheels are turning and you can see that you can take a vulnerability that is the most critical, most perfect vulnerability that you need to fix. And then if you tie it in to an efficiency-based workflow, you can actually reduce the amount of tickets you need to create. You can reduce the amount of work that needs to happen by the teams so they can spend more time remediating. And you can get a lot more vulnerabilities fixed with the same amount of work effort, right? So it's like, hey, while we're here, also do this, right? So it allows you to start opening up some opportunities for how you want to think about your workflows with ticketing. And obviously you have to just do that at scale multiple times over. And then the fourth option I want to talk about is what we call action-based tickets. So an action-based ticket is much more, it's like kind of like adding that fourth criteria, that fourth additional layer of filtering, where you discover a finding on an asset, your VM analyst triages it, you identify other vulnerabilities on the same asset, you identify the team that owns the asset, you identify the team that owns other assets with the same vulnerabilities. But this time, instead of compiling it based on vulnerabilities on the asset, you actually you take it that step further and say, which of all of these vulnerabilities on these different assets for the same team have the same solution, right? And that solution can be represented in a whole bunch of different ways. It can be represented by upgrade a particular software library in my code repository. It could be run a specific patch. But what you're doing is you're actually flipping vulnerabilities on their head and saying, we're not ticketing by a vulnerability at all. We're ticketing by a solution, and the vulnerabilities that are fixed by implementing that solution now are just kind of a detail or their metadata for that vulnerability ticketing workflow. So then what happens is now you have a list of actions, and then you prioritize those actions, and you can prioritize those actions in a bunch of different ways. One way that we see pretty commonly is what we call cumulative risk. So this would be like, hey, what particular action actually represents the most amount of risk being reduced on a particular, in your environment, really, or in this case, it's by a particular team, right? So what action can this team take that will reduce risk the most with the least amount of effort? And then you create the ticket based on the action that you want to prioritize, and the team consumes the ticket, and you go on the rest of your way in the workflow. So this is how you can start to really scale up and think about your ticketing workflows and do this. Obviously the challenge is how do we do this at scale, and how do we do this in a way that really keeps everything in sync. So this is why when you look at is it necessary to have a middleman between your vulnerability scanners and your ticketing systems? This is where it becomes very helpful, right? Because it's this type of process right here where 95% of the work of ticketing really comes into play, and transforming that information comes into play, and being able to turn it into something that actually is a real ticket instead of just dumping vulnerabilities into a ticketing system and then they never get worked on because they're in the backlog forever, right? So this is really the idea that when you want to go from like level 1 maturity up towards like level 5 maturity of how you manage ticketing, this is the direction that we normally see really sophisticated organizations do this, right? So anyway, I'm going to take a pause for a moment because there's a question. And the question is, how do you manage this with superseded patches? Great. Okay, so for those that are familiar with the concept of a superseded patch, or sorry, not familiar with the concept, a superseded patch is, let's say I have Chrome version 1 and Chrome version 2 on 2 different assets, and I could upgrade both of them to version 3 and fix both of those vulnerabilities. That's what a superseded patch is. It would say, hey, let's go just focus on 10 point, version 3. So the correct answer here really is It sounds really simple on the surface to use supersedence of patches. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and you have to get a little bit more sophisticated with your decision-making process. So like, for example, Chrome is an easy one because it's hard to mess up Chrome, but imagine instead it's like a version of Java, right? And you really, it's hard to kind of migrate multiple versions of Java all at the same time, or it can take months and months to do that. And so there are scenarios when you would have remediation actions that will be superseded patches in the context of this question, where it's like, yeah, just upgrade to the latest version and you're actually going to take care of a whole bunch, and that's the remediation action. But then there are other scenarios where you actually need to break those remediation actions into multiple steps or multiple different remediation actions, where on this set of assets, we actually need to upgrade in multiple layers, right? And so I use the example of Java or JDKs or anything like that. And anybody that dealt with the Log4j vulnerability is probably feeling that as well. There are some vulnerabilities that are very complex to solve, and it's very difficult to use superseded patches. So superseded patches, I would say, are yes, absolutely can use them. That's probably the easiest way to do something like this or to do a workflow like this, but you don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily work every time. It's kind of like works some of the time, actually a good chunk of the time, but it doesn't capture everything. So this is where the maturity really starts to come in. But yeah, thank you for the question. That's a great one. There's a lot of nuance there too. So very much appreciate it. The next question was, no, there's another question, was, are you saying we can automate ticket creation based on solution? So there are a lot of different ways to do that. Let's see. There's another question that just came in. So the next question was around, can we automate ticket creation based on solutions? So I'm assuming that in the context they're talking about Nucleus specifically. So the best way to think about this is there's actually a lot of different ways to do this. Most organizations kind of have their own kind of interface with patch management systems to be able to do things like that, or they'll use like kind of this patch supersedence is a good example, or they'll use software update versions to do this. Within Nucleus today, we already pre-group the vulnerabilities themselves by solution at a low level, right? So we have this concept that we call unique vulnerability. A unique vulnerability is, hey, show me all the instances of a vulnerability that actually all have the same solution. Now, in the question of superseding patches, it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from the superseding patching question. Superseding patches is like, hey, like just upgrade to this version and you'll fix all of these. The way Nucleus handles it today, and I keep saying today, and I'll explain why, but the way Nucleus handles it today is here's all the solutions that are the same within a particular version. So it'd be like, hey, upgrade, Chrome from 1 to 2. Here's all the vulnerabilities that relates from Chrome version 1, and they need to upgrade to version 2. But we don't do it across, across versions today because of what I described before. Supersedence works some of the time, but not all the time. And so we felt this was the foundation, but we are planning to roll that out as a feature that we're actually looking at in the next few months. So that's why I have future here on the little brackets, is because that's an upcoming feature in Nucleus. But I didn't want to let a Nucleus feature be a blocker for delivering value and education in theory to the masses here. So that's kind of why we're talking about this today. Now, the next question was from Brian. Which is, how are we seeing organizations manage when it's not operating system based? So if it's a vulnerability on a system used by another team, where the application library's owners are not tracked to easily ticket on. Yes. So now we're talking about asset management and asset inventory questions. So there are additional steps you can take inside of this workflow. There are additional steps that you can take upstream of this workflow. And so the answer is it depends. Honestly, we should probably do a topic webinar on this particular, scenario itself. But what normally ends up happening is you have multiple layers of ownership, and you have to define what ownership means to you as an organization. Oftentimes, you have like owners of the asset or of the operating system, and then you'll have owners of the applications, and you might even have owners that are separate on kind of infrastructure built on top of the system itself, right? So you might have, we call those at Nucleus, we call those business owners. Then we have support team, and then we have kind of like just a generic owner concept, right? Now, generally, you don't have great data around this, and that is a project that most organizations need to work on over time in order to get to the point where they're able to manage that at scale. But you got to start somewhere, and normally you can do it within a team pretty well. And normally you start with where you can have the most impact. So most organizations do start with the OS level vulnerabilities, but there are ways you can stitch together other pieces of information to actually do kind of library-based ticketing as well. So like, for example, I'll use a Nucleus example just because it's something that obviously I'm very familiar with. So like if you upload an SCA result to Nucleus, we know what libraries you're using because we see it in the vulnerabilities that you have. And we also know where that code will get deployed because we see it from, say, like a tenable scan or from a registry key or whatever elsewhere. And so we actually know that there are multiple vulnerabilities on the same assets, on the same kind of network host, but they come from different places. Now, the code repository itself might have a different owner than the infrastructure. And so you actually will track ownership separately. And then in Nucleus, you would actually create your logic or your ticketing workflows to say, well, any vulnerability that shows up on this asset, which is kind of a sub asset within the context of an asset in Nucleus, then actually the vulnerability gets assigned separately than it would be if it came up, it was an operating system layer. And there's some nuanced ways, like you can use kind of CPE based stuff, which I know isn't great, but like, you know, you can start to say, hey, this vulnerability is application layer versus network layer versus kind of hardware layer. And so we see automation like that oftentimes being used. But it's kind of a big rabbit hole that I could go down all day, and I want to stay on topic. Hopefully that answered some of your question, Brian. But you got to start somewhere. It generally starts with OS level, but there absolutely are ways to build on top of the kind of at the application layer, and most of that is handled through actually integrations with like Git repos, and like you have to have a concerted project and process for that. So a lot of folks that I work with will actually, they'll use like whatever, like AWS tags and things like that to make that happen. So. And I see somebody raised their hands. I don't think we have the ability for you to do audio. So if you wouldn't mind typing your question in, I will be happy to answer it. But yeah, I don't know if we support audio back from the audience in this. So while you're typing that up, the last kind of section here is, because I did want to leave a little bit of time for questions, is I just wanted to kind of wrap up and do some of these takeaways so we can take this back for you. So the first is that I just want to like really hammer home that your priorities as a VM team are not the priorities of the business. And so when we think in terms of lists and priorities, the businesses on the converse side think in terms of outcomes and efficiencies. So our job from a communication perspective, from a process perspective, is actually to match up our priorities and merge it into this larger idea of outcomes and efficiencies. And you're really not going to get anywhere with culture change or with even getting management buy-in if you don't acknowledge this and then endeavor to change the way that you're talking about ticketing within your kind of vulnerability management program. The second main thing that I wanted to hopefully come away with this is that there's actually tons of automation that can occur even with some basic workflows. So in the example, I forgot to change the bullets here. Whoops. But there's lots of automation that you can happen even with basic workflows. So if we think all the way back to that first workflow that I talked about, just, like managing tickets and vulnerability-based tickets, and that's it, just by being able to say, hey, let's focus the VM team on creating, epics, and then we have an automated system create the tickets and manage the tickets for us. That actually saves a huge amount of time and flex. It gives us a lot of flexibility, really, at a large scale, even without having to do a whole lot, right? You can implement something pretty basic and pretty simple, and you can get tons of value from that without having to be super sophisticated. So I always say, like, we want to start simple, we want to focus on simple, and then you can iterate up to it. So hopefully you saw that a little bit today. And then the third thing is that this is where the grouping was supposed to, bullet points were supposed to be, which is that when you map your findings and your vulnerabilities into the business processes, this unlocks huge amounts of outcomes and opportunities for you to think about things in a totally different way. This is where you can start to, and we really view this as the future of vulnerability management, is that the concept of vulnerabilities they're always going to be around, but what's going to end up happening is that vulnerability management is just going to become a translation layer for engineering to be able to, actually take vulnerability prioritization and turn it into something that's more digestible by the organization. And we actually think that it's more compared to like a product manager as opposed to as a vulnerability manager, right? So a product manager takes the intakes information from all these different places, right? From sales, from marketing, from just competitive analysis, and then turns that into a priority list, and they decompose those stories. There's tons of work that goes into decomposing stories into something that engineers can build. And I think we're going to see a transition where vulnerability management is going to have to embed with kind of that idea of being more of a product manager to be able to actually turn vulnerabilities into something that the business really understands. And we do that through training and embedding and all those sorts of fun things. So that's the other takeaway. And we really view that as the future. And then finally, when you prioritize by this concept and if you can pull this off, it unlocks huge potential for you as a business, because then you have the opportunity to redefine how you think about everything, right? So I think about things like SLAs, right? So, well, what happens to our SLAs when now we've converted all of our vulnerabilities into outcomes? Okay, well now my SLA is tied to an outcome, not tied to an individual vulnerability. Now it's inheriting those SLAs from the outcome. And so, every team might have different SLAs on the same vulnerability, whereas today we just do broad-based SLAs like, hey, fix all critical vulnerabilities within 30 days. You can actually use SLAs the way that they're designed, which is to measure organizational health. And that's just one example. I'm going to go off on a soapbox to keep talking about it. But I just, as an example of how you can use this way of thinking and this translation to really create something special out the other end to be able to make it happen. So with that, we are actually at the end of our day today, and I appreciate everybody coming. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat now. If you would like to come to the next webinar, we are going to be talking about benchmarking and metrics, which does tie in pretty heavily to what we talked about today. And we will go, and we'll talk about all of that stuff in the next one as well. And it's going to tie back to this. But yeah, we're going to be doing this. We do these every month. We're trying to bring value and not just vendor pitches to the market, so we can help share a lot of the lessons that we're learning as well. Now, as well, same thing. If you want to see what Nucleus does, this is the main pitch that we do at the end. Just feel free to check us out. Obviously happy to do deep dives on what it is that we do as an organization, as a product. But these are the types of challenges and solutions that we're passionate about solving. So if you're also passionate about it, we'd love to connect with you. Thank you so much for coming today. There is one more question that it looks like I might have to answer. Feel free to stick around, everybody. I'm going to answer this question real quick, and then we'll hop off. But thank you again so much, everybody, for attending today. The question is, how are we getting the solution or action information? Because tools like Tenable are very inconsistent. So yeah, that's a fun topic, because it's going to require definitely a more in-depth conversation, because there's a lot of nuance here as well around how you get to solutions. But the short answer is that, like, at the most basic level, you do it by mapping a particular vulnerability to a particular version of a piece of software. And then you basically have to look through all of the kind of out there industry standard places where vulnerability databases exist and say, at what point does that software version no longer map to this particular vulnerability? And it can be pretty inconsistent. So there are obviously additional ways on top of that you can do it, where you can do some like data analysis and things. But yeah, if I had to guess, tools like Tenable are probably just using like NVD's CPE maps, and they're probably doing it that way. And that's generally the way that works as an industry. But like I said, it's pretty vague and confusing, a lot of this stuff. And so that's why we're having these conversations. But happy to have that conversation deeper with you. With that, everybody, I want to just thank you so much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all again on the next one. Thanks for sharing. See you next time. See you, everybody.